Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we cover today's issues and controversial topics from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and I'm joined this evening by Kevin McGary, the founder of Vote God 2012, but also president of the Frederick Douglass Foundation, author of multiple books, and because we don't run from controversy, we run straight for it. We're going to be covering the topic this evening of abortion and its impacts on the minority community specifically.
Right.
So, Kevin, welcome to the show. Are you buckled
Thank
in
you.
properly? Are we ready to go after
raring
this?
and ready to go, man. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, knowing you on a personal level, I know you are a staunch advocate for the pro-life movement. It's a major component of the Frederick Douglass Foundation and what you do there. The question is, have you always been pro-life, or were you in a different frame of mind previously?
Well, because I was born and raised in inner city San Francisco and fully indoctrinated in Democrat ideology, the pro-life issue was, was a convenient annoyance, I guess, is what I would try to frame it as in my early life. So as I participated in, various activities and whatnot, I didn't feel as strongly as I feel about abortion as I do now.
Right.
But I didn't have a conscience for it at the time either. And so a lot of my evolution has come by way of my faith and just being more aware about what abortion is and what it is really not. And so part of that was education as well.
Education. Were there any specific events that made this a hotter topic for you, or was it just the education?
Well, I think primarily it's the education. Once you, sort of lift up the covers and dig under what the whole abortion movement is all about, how it was started, who it was started by, you look back historically, figures like Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, then you begin to understand, you begin to have a more healthy perspective of how to really view the subject.
Right.
The reality is what we think we understand about the subject, especially as liberal Democrats, is may not be in essence what it really is.
Right.
And that was at least true for me.
What I find interesting is that we typically cover the abortion issue when we're discussing it out in the world from an emotional perspective and a woman's rights issue versus from a scientific perspective or looking at other things. For me, for example, I used to believe that there was a woman's body, and who am I as a man to be able to tell them what to do with their body?
Right.
And a lot of times people are led into abortions thinking that it's just a piece of flesh or something like that. It's like it's a little tumor or a skin thing, and they just remove it and you go. But for me, having met all of my children, met them in the ultrasound beforehand, and seeing them suck their thumbs or turn away so you can't tell if they're a little boy or a little girl or those kinds of things, it makes it hard when you have the technology to be able to see that movement.
Right.
And those responses and dodging. It makes it hard to just say it's an emotional thing and that's not a being or a life.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to dismiss based on that. Yeah.
But then as I started doing research over the last several years and some of the history that you're going to share this evening, it becomes even clearer that this was never about choice.
Never about women's right to choose
So you started talking a little bit about history, and you were talking about some of the good guys. You also mentioned Margaret Sanger. Talk to us about, since she's kind of the founder of Planned Parenthood and one of the major movers and shakers in or takers in the abortion industry. Tell me a little bit about her history and her perspectives.
So what a lot of people may not know is that the whole abortion subject is really not about women's rights. It's about selectively, it's selective genocide, basically, and it's strategically targeted, especially towards the black community. And the reason why I say that, I know that's, some
people are going to start thinking that they're going to call you a Nazi and say it's eugenics.
Is because Margaret Sanger was a self-avowed eugenicist. I mean, she believed in eugenics. She believed in a master white race. She's the one out of her own mouth that said, blacks are reckless breeders. They're infirmed, feeble-minded, weeds of society, the scourge of society, those types of things. This is from Margaret Sanger. So if anybody has any doubts, just Google Margaret Sanger quotes, and you get the whole montage of what she has said herself about blacks. She hated blacks.
She was a regular speaker at the KKK Women's Auxiliary.
Regular speaker at the KKK women's meetings. She hated blacks, and she devised a perfect strategy to help us to self-eliminate. And that strategy came in the form of what she called Planned Parenthood. This was her
part
strategy.
of the Negro Project.
It's part of the Negro Project.
Right.
It was her strategy. Unfortunately, it's been working masterfully. We intend to change that. We have to change that because right now we're eliminating ourselves.
Right. But it must be okay if the pastors are involved and saying it's all right, right? Because the pastors within the black church have been advocates of choice.
That's right. Well, even back when Margaret Sanger, she couldn't get a whole lot of traction back in the day with abortion because certain communities like the black community and Hispanic community weren't buying into her logic or rhetoric, if you will. But she did something pretty devious and insidious, if you will. She actually paid black pastors $100. Her biggest point was she knew that black people tend to go to church every Sunday. We tend to have high standards for our pastors. We tend to listen to them and allow them to lead us. And she knew this, and she said, what can we do to really manipulate this black community and get them to glom on to this message of abortion? So she devised a scheme and actually was successful with it. She had black pastors, for every black pastor that would get on their pulpit and preach the merits of abortion over the pulpit, she'd pay them $100 per sermon. And there were a lot of black pastors that did exactly that. And it's unfathomable when you consider the evil scourge of what abortion is and why it was actually promoted. It was all about, bigotry and racism against blacks. To think that you had black pastors at the time in the 70s, this is fairly recent history, to get up and preach the merits of abortion over the pulpit it's unfathomable.
Yes, because of, like you said, the faith that the congregation has in them as responsible leaders. So people will say, okay, well, maybe that's how it got started, but it doesn't still have an impact in that way in the black community now, does it?
Right. So what a lot of people don't understand is part of her strategy was to completely inundate the black community with her abortion mills. And so she strategically placed, right now today it's approximately 90% by some estimates of abortion mills in and around black communities and Hispanic communities. If it were truly about women's rights and she just felt all women equally needed to have access to abortion, Walmart does a great demographic marketing analysis for her. Her abortion mill should be parked in and around every Walmart in the country. That's the demographic. It's primarily white women who would go to Walmart, and that would be the demographic. But that's not what she chose to do. She strategically positioned them in and around black neighborhoods, even though blacks only represent 12% of the population. Women in the black community represent a total of 6% of the population. And childbearing ages 15 to 44, that's 3% of the population. So explain to me now how 90% of all abortion mills are catering to 3% of the population. There's such a disparity there. For anybody to say that it's not strategic, that it's not bigoted, that it's not targeted, that it is not black genocide. I like that term, black genocide, and that's actually Jesse Jackson's term in the 1970s.
Before he went over to the other side.
Before he actually started running for president.
Right.
He actually called it what it was.
Right.
He says abortion is strategically targeted at the black community and it is black genocide. And then he began to run for president, completely changed his mind, and he's been throwing the black community under the bus in relation to this issue ever since. So, ever since then, he's been, pro-abort. This is a scourge. If people just paid attention to the percentages, the disproportional impact that it has on the black community, blacks make up approximately 40+% of all abortions that have been done. We have approximately 54 million abortions that have been conducted since it's been legal by Roe v. Wade. And of that, approximately 23 to 25 million have been black kids. So it's been a very destructive, a very effective, however, if you're a racist, bigot, strategist, it's been effective for eliminating the people the undesirables that you wanted to get rid of in the first place.
Right.
Now, what's particularly insidious about this is our president and people in the Democrat Party know full well what this is. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, our Supreme Court Justice, said what it is. She said, I never thought that this was about women's rights or women's reproductive issues. This is about eliminating the undesirables. If you Google Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and you would see that she actually said that quote, just a few years ago.
Right.
I think it was 2009.
Yeah.
So the people at the highest levels in the Democrat Party fully understand this issue.
Right.
Yet we have them going to Planned Parenthood 50-year anniversaries. President Obama did a video, celebration for Margaret Sanger, called her a great woman.
She's a progressive hero.
And she's a progressive hero. She's a great woman, women's pioneer, and all this other stuff, knowing full well that she targeted his community for elimination.
Right.
Her words are documented.
Right.
Hillary Clinton was actually at that celebration and lauded praises on how great of a woman Margaret Sanger is. This is the Democrat Party that fully embraces the systematic elimination of black Americans by way of this scourge.
Well, and it's not just here. I mean, they are also taking U.S. taxpayer money and giving it to countries within Africa to further reduce populations in those areas.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. One of the first things that President Obama did when he got in office, I think it was in day 2.
Day 1 or 2.
Day 1 or 2. First thing he did was reinstate Mexico City policy, whereby during the Bush years, Bush did away with that policy that we were spending hundreds of millions of dollars sending abortions overseas to third world countries primarily, mostly Africa, but also some parts of China and South America. And then we stopped that when the Bush was in office. One of the first things that President Obama did when he got in office was reinstate the policy, immediately sent $400 million, it's probably more like $500 or $600 million now, that we're sending overseas every single year to exterminate kids, the unborn kids in the womb. So, I mean, that's what we have, a president that's so committed to abortion that he's willing to export it.
Sure.
And it's unfortunate, but that's one of the more unfortunate exports that we have out of the United States.
Well, and what's interesting also is even within his administration, there are people with bioethics types of backgrounds who, for those of us of faith that believe that life is precious from womb to tomb and that all life has value, there are people that believe that you're not a human until you are able to determine the difference between today and tomorrow, because that's a higher level of thinking. It's a more abstract. And looking at that, there are those that believe, and it's even come out within the last month or two, bioethicists saying up until, it could be the age 2, I mean, or minimally a couple of weeks after, you can decide whether or not you can have a full refund. It makes no sense. But also when we start thinking along that slippery slope kind of a terminology, then anyone who's mentally handicapped is no longer human.
Right.
Anyone who has been hit with dementia is no longer human.
Right.
And therefore their life is no longer of value.
Right. Right.
And so we have to be very careful.
We have to be very careful of that. Now, even Bernard Nathanson, who was really the one that came up with the cliche woman's right to choose, it was actually him and a colleague who helped develop that cliche. So, it's kind of ironic. We have women holding on to that for dear life. Oh, it's my right to choose, woman's right to choose. And the reality is you had 2 men that were really sexist. They, by their own admission, they were looking for, well, what terms, cliches can we invent as 2 men to really manipulate women and have gullible women glom onto it like it's theirs. So they actually came up with women's right to choose. 2 men did, as a way to manipulate women And guess what? That's working masterfully as well.
Well, but even if you look at Roe versus Wade, Ms. Roe, I believe it was, after seeing the science and seeing what's available after the fact, is no longer pro-choice or
Right.
pro-abortion either.
Neither is Bernard Nathanson. By his own admission, he felt that he aborted somewhere around 75,000 babies. Um, that was before ultrasound. When the science actually came around. Now, this is a self-admitted abortionist
Mm-hmm.
who had been doing it for many, many years, decades. And when the technology actually came around, ultrasound came around, he repented. He says, I've been killing babies all this time.
Mm-hmm.
He really was somehow he was really innocent, or he felt he was innocent in his motives. But when the science was there, he really saw that he was murdering kids this entire time.
Mm-hmm.
And from that time, he had done no more abortions, and actually became a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And he died, I think it was last year, a year before. But basically, the science is pretty clear. Most scientists now recognize that life begins at conception. I mean, we have the technology that really confirms that.
Mm-hmm.
So when we start to mess with life, well, what is life and when does it start and how do we redefine it? We're doing the same thing with marriage. How do we redefine marriage? God instituted marriage, but we want to redefine it to make it more convenient for our terms. God instituted life. Everything begins and ends with life, right? But we want to redefine it for our current modern progressive standards. And this is a real travesty. It's evil.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to call, we Americans, and especially we people of faith, need to call evil evil. And if we have people participating in evil agendas, we need to not support them,
Yeah.
and not support the party and not vote for them. We need to vote for principled people who actually align with God.
And so I'm assuming you're against Planned Parenthood's funding by the federal government for these types of services?
Well, I don't think the federal government should be funding these types of services. There were already some laws in the books that precluded the government from participating in this. Now with Obamacare, we're getting more back into that business, even though it was promised that we wouldn't be doing that. Basically a lot of promises about Obamacare we're finding were complete untruths or lies, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we're finding that there are ways around that people who are strategic masterminds who are looking for ways to, sort of manipulate population and sort of take control, population control. They'll find ways to skirt around existing laws, a la Obamacare, which
Mm-hmm.
which has a disproportionate impact on, as you said, infants as well as elderly.
The elderly as well.
When you
Yes.
start taking a look at the whole life system and take a look at how they've architected determining the value of life at various stages. And if you don't have value here at the very beginning or here at the end, then, if you need care, you're not going to get it.
Yeah, well, there is a difference between having access to health insurance and having access to health care,
Right.
for sure.
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and sometimes those are not clear definitions.
Right.
And so, looking at those kinds of things, what do you think we need to do as a voting population, or how can we educate ourselves about the true evils or the true history of abortion?
Well, so when people want to make excuses for, well, they use a woman's right to choose. They use, in cases of race or incest, or rape or incest. The reality is that we have some very good people that were in as early as the mid 1800s. Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was, of course, a pioneer of the women's suffrage movement, women's rights, and was a conservative. And she was simpatico with, and they actually worked and collaborated together with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, said, look, if we made exceptions for rape and incest, I wouldn't be here.
Right.
And he was correct. So even back then, and rape and incest were running rampant, he understood that, look, I came out of that scenario, and I, Frederick Douglass, have a pretty good life. The reality is that, yes, there was a lot of human suffrage taking place at the time, But to just brazenly eliminate all people who were, coming out of rape and incest would have been irresponsible.
Mm-hmm.
And so Susan B. Anthony stood up for women's rights, to support life at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, it changed, and now it's to a point where we have people who are completely disconnected from the realities of how the women's rights movement actually started,
Right.
And what it was actually founded upon, which
Mm-hmm.
was preventing women from doing things like abortion and having to undergo those types of treatments. Now we run to them. I mean, it's sort of we went completely 360. It's upside down.
Well, we appreciate you coming in and sharing the history and the perspective with us, because a lot of times it is just an emotional conversation without any factual basis. So, Kevin, thank you for joining us, and we'll be talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
At this point, we need to take a quick break to show you some information from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum.
Say, well, I say I'm a constitutional law attorney. And they say, oh, really? What kind of constitutional law attorney? I say, well, I'm the true kind. The kind that believe that the Constitution is what the Constitution says and what it was intended to say. Anything beyond that is tyranny and should not be allowed.
So it's come to this, my friends. You ready for the second American Revolution against a ruling class that simply lectures but does not listen or defend the American people? It is government versus the people. Am I right? Look at the Electoral College example. Right? A leftist popular challenge to states' rights. You think the founders weren't brilliant people? Did they not know what they were doing by carefully calibrating to get the small states and the big states to come together? Why does Wyoming get 2 senators in California? Actually, I'd rather have Wyoming's 2 senators.
And that was a commercial break from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. The Conservative Forum meets the first Tuesday of each month at 432 Steerland Road here in Mountain View, except for during the month of July when the 4th of July celebration pushes the meeting to the second Tuesday of the month. More at theconservativeforum.com. And just so you know, upcoming guest speakers will be for June. Timothy Sandifer from the Pacific Legal Foundation, Tom Tancredo will be coming in July, Jack Cashel in August, and John Fund in September, and more to come after that. Again, check for more details at theconservativeforum.com. This evening we did a lot of speaking and a lot of educating about the abortion topic, which is one that until you really do the level of research that's necessary, it does remain an emotional type of a topic. But abortion is actually something that has permeated into our society and into our government in ways that you may not be expecting. A few years ago, I had the opportunity, or I punished myself by reading about 500 pages of the Affordable Health Care Act. And when I did, I saw terminology such as expanding birth intervals in one of the subheadings. And what that particular section was about was that if the government decided that you were having your children too closely together, they could actually come to your home and counsel you on how to spread them out more effectively. It's a practice that's already been used in Philadelphia through social services and others, where they'll actually offer you a ride to the clinic to space your children out more effectively. That is not choice, that is coercion. But additionally, I had an opportunity to speak a couple of weeks ago to an obstetrician who was trained in one of the Southern California university systems. And what we may not realize is that in California there have been forced sterilizations and forced abortions in the past, but even as recently as the 90s, what she had mentioned to me was that protocols were that if an illegal alien came into the country, they would help her birth her child, but they would also sterilize her unbeknownst to her as part of their protocol. The topic of abortion goes way beyond choice. It goes to people's rights. If you want to really talk about a right that a woman has to what happens inside of her body, we have to have an open dialogue about what's happening, what's possible, and what we must stand together to prevent. I'm Chris Pareja. This has been The Right Side, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Have a great evening.